Welcome to the Collective Arcana, a channel all about tabletop gaming. Today I wanted to do a tutorial on an easy dice tray. Even if you don't think you have the most artistic talent, you can pull this off. Here's what you'll need. We'll talk a little bit about these items individually as we go, but I'll also put more information in the description. So here I've got a cheap canvas from a store called Daiso, which is sort of this discount store. This isn't the highest quality made canvas. You can see it's stapled down and the canvas is cut crooked. There's no glue holding it together at all. But we're going to use this today. The method that we're going to be using is going to actually cover up most of these flaws anyway. But if you have a nicer canvas, then that's probably the way to go. But if this is your only choice, then don't worry about it. The first thing I'm going to do is just cut this excess off, just so it doesn't overhang. You could glue it down, but I think it would be easier just to cut so we don't have to worry about it coming back up. This doesn't have to be perfect because the seam is going to be covered anyway with hot glue, but I used a pretty dull blade here. I ran out, so my cut was very sloppy. So you can see how little it matters, but if you want to take your time and do a really good job, then use a sharp blade and cut it nice and neat so you don't have any fraying like I have here. Next, I'm going to wipe down the canvas with rubbing alcohol, which is completely optional. I just do this in case I have any kind of oils or lotions on my hand, and it might prevent the paint from sticking. So this is just sort of a habit. I do this with everything I paint, so you don't have to do this, but you never know what's on there, especially if it wasn't wrapped in plastic before. Who knows how many fingers have touched it in the craft store, so it's not a bad idea. The next thing we're going to do is some hot glue gun art, which if you think that you're not terribly good at painting, that doesn't matter because you don't actually need any painting skills, because we're just going to use the texture to guide our brush. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly sketch this out for you just so you can see, since the hot glue is going to be clear and it's hard to see, the pattern we're kind of going with here. It's not very complicated. You can't really mess it up because any organic shape is going to look right. So even if you're not very good at drawing, it's probably going to look just fine. So first we're going to start out with a knot because, we want it to look like bark. So a good place to start is the knot. For that, I'm just going to do like a C shape and then another C shape right over top of it. And then a big C around the outside of them both. And we'll just start our wavies, just pulling down. And you'll kind of follow this sort of method until you fill up the space. So this is the pattern we're going to be doing with the hot glue. I'm going to freehand it and just kind of rush through this, but if you want to do a really good job, you could even take the pencil and draw it directly on the canvas frame itself and have a line to follow. If you're more comfortable with that, that's probably a pretty good way to move forward. If you got a cheap canvas like I did that's just stapled down, you might want to just glue these little flaps down. If you have one that's nicer made, you might not even have to worry about this. It might be completely wrapped around. But I got this for $1.50, so it's not very high quality. Just a note on these canvases. You can get these really cheap from places that are like dollar stores that have art supplies, like I mentioned, Daiso, but also craft stores always have those 40% off coupons right on their phone, so you can just take your phone and they'll scan it directly. So even if you don't have access to a discount store, you can just go to Michael's or something like that with your coupon and get these for just a couple of bucks. They're pretty cheap. Now I'm going to start drawing the design we talked about with my hot glue. With the C shape. So first I got to decide where my knot's going to be. And I think I'll just put it over the staple just to cover it up. So I'll start building these C shapes and just kind of trail down the edges. You might not have as much room to do the perfect C's like we did on the paper, but that's okay. You don't want it to be perfect. You want each one to look different. Something you're going to learn pretty quickly about hot glue is that if you try to stretch it while it's still at max temperature, it's going to string all over the place. So work a lot slower than I did here. I really rushed through this, but if you take your time, you probably won't have very many stringies. And if you do, just don't pull at them until they're completely cool, and they won't continue to stretch. They're a lot easier to clean up that way. So here I'm just going to try to blend in this loose edge from where I cut off the excess, and I've got some fraying going on. So I'm going to use the hot glue gun to hide that. I'm actually going to follow this corner seam and see if I can sort of hide it. And it doesn't have to come out perfectly even. It actually looks better if it comes out a little glumpy. So just let it do its thing and don't overanalyze it. Just keep moving with it. And I'm gonna actually put a little extra glue here just to texture over that staple to hide it when we paint. Now I'm drawing this next C to blend in over the seam as if it wasn't there. That'll disrupt the pattern of the long cut line. And then I'll just start making these wavy lines down straight and do that down the edge. And I'm going to be sure to hit staples on the way too, because I want to hide those. And I'll admit this is a pretty tedious process, and as I mentioned, I'm doing this as quickly as possible, and it's pretty sloppy. But if you really took your time and did a really careful job, your end product is going to look 1,000 times better than mine did. But if you have very little artistic talent and you are impatient and you're in a hurry, it's still going to look good. Just continue to make those C's and wavy lines down the long edges and throw a knot in here and there, and it'll eventually build up. Make sure you get the sides on the outside. I'm not going to worry about the inside too much, just because, I mean, you're going to have dice hitting that part anyway, so it might end up coming loose. So I would just do the outside. And you don't have to, but I think it makes it look kind of cool. Aside from the C shape, you can also do kind of a swirly shape. So we're going to draw like the number 6. And then do the same method where you're just kind of outlining the edge and then, well, making a squiggle line down. Okay, now we have our glue down, and as you can see, it looks like a hot mess, as it should. So this is kind of what I was saying, where you don't really have to worry about being able to draw. It's not really about that. It's more about just creating texture for us to paint with. Now we're going to clean it up a little bit though. We have some of these little pieces of hot glue that need cleaned up. Once the glue is completely cooled, we can pick at these and they won't stretch. So I'm going to do that now. Next, we're going to paint the whole thing black, so just get your black acrylic paint out from the craft store and maybe add a little bit of water just so it'll stretch a little further, because it's pretty thick straight out of the bottle. Now we're going to paint the frame black. Make sure you get the sides and the inside as well. I'm not going to worry too much about this big surface here since I'm going to be putting fabric down. If you're not putting fabric down, you might want to tape this off and come back to that after we do the frame, after the whole thing is complete, and paint that last. This needs to be fairly dry before we move on to the next step, but acrylic paint dries really fast, so it shouldn't take very long. The first color I'm going to add is the darker brown, and I'm going to use a bigger paintbrush here just to speed it up. And you're not going to use a heavy hand to add this brown in. You don't mind if some of the black pokes through for this step. So I'm going to kind of do it quickly and not worry about covering every square inch. You don't want to cover every square inch. You mostly just want to use a light touch and pass over everything at least once. I should also mention that you can use spray paint for that first step when you're painting everything black, especially if you plan on not using fabric. And while that's a faster way to paint this, it will take much longer to dry. And the paint will need to be completely bone dry if you use spray paint before you add acrylic on top. I prefer to just paint it with the black acrylic to begin with because it dries so fast and it doesn't take that long to lay it down the old-fashioned way. But I'm gonna put a little paint on my brush. I'm not gonna load it up all the way, and just lay it down kind of lightly and quickly and just kind of skimming the top here. It's better to lay this down in light layers and build it up while you kind of get the hang of the consistency, and you'll eventually find how much pressure you really need to add. This is also hard to mess up because we're going to do some things to it afterwards that hides any kind of spots that maybe it's in too heavy. Don't forget to hit the sides and the edges as well. So next we're going to use a method called dry brushing, which is used on minis a lot, terrain, and I actually go into this in my rock painting tutorial. And what this does is it hits the highest points of your texture and automatically paints them. So instead of going through with a little tiny brush and adding great detail into something like this, it just automatically paints it for you just with using a light hand. So we're just going to take the littlest bit, just like this much, and I'm going to mix it in and get some of the excess paint off so that it's just spread out through the bristles real lightly. And this just puts a light layer on the very edges of the bristle. And then I'll just very gently hit the very, very top. So for this, I like to use a blush brush. I'm using an old makeup brush that I don't need anymore, and I moved it over to the paint box. Obviously, don't use it for makeup again. But you can get these at the Dollar Tree for $1, just a typical blush brush. This one's kind of funny looking. It doesn't have a handle, but you can just get the old-fashioned kind. I just like to use the big, fluffy brushes for big projects like this. Good for terrain also. It doesn't work as well in little tiny minis, but for something like this, it makes it go much quicker. But if you don't have one or you don't want to go buy one, you can also just use a really big paintbrush. So as you can see, it's just hitting the highest points of the texture and it's not getting in there in the darker spots. It creates a really cool shadow effect. So we're just going to do that all over with this big fluffy makeup brush. And you can play with it with different amounts of paint. You'll get the hang of it as you go. If you want, you can do a couple of different shades. Maybe add some greens and stuff in there too. But we're just going to do this one color for now. If you do accidentally put it on too heavy in one spot, don't worry about it. We're going to fix that later. Try not to do it all over, but a spot here and there might actually make it look even better. And once again, don't forget to do the outer edges. The inner edges, you can just dab it in here and there and it'll blend in just fine. So at this point, you're probably getting a feel for the dry brushing. And we're going to add another layer of even lighter brown. I'm just going to mix white in with the brown I was already using. And we're going to go back over this with an even lighter hand. We're barely going to hit it and add another layer of color. So here you can see the contrast of the next color up. Quite a bit lighter. This time I'm just going to hit some spots. I'm going to leave some spots blank, especially while my brush is more loaded up. Once almost all the paint's off the brush, I might go back over just for consistency's sake, but I want some spots to be darker than others. If you wanted to do a more vine effect, I would still start with that brown layer, but then for the next two layers, I would do a dark green and then a lighter green. And it might have a cool sort of ivy, druidy effect. So that's something to play around with too. Next, we're going to do the ink wash, which will add some of those shadows back in. An ink wash is just watered down paint. So we're just going to take the big brush again and some black paint and thin it out with some water. And now we're just going to paint over everything we've already done, which I know is a little scary if you've never ink washed before, but you'll see that the more water you add to it, it'll settle in the cracks in the hot glue and it'll create this really cool shadow effect. So see here, it looks like I'm just painting over everything and losing all the dry brushing work I did. But I'm going to add water and it's going to thin out and it'll roll off of all those high points. This will also take a little getting used to, but unlike the dry brushing, you can just keep starting over right on the spot. You can dab it up, soak it up with a paper towel, start over, or you can just add more water or add more pigment. It's a lot more flexible in this step. So no matter what happens at this step, you don't need to panic. So here's zoomed in, you can see how it's naturally creating these shadows around the high parts. Once I've ink washed the whole piece, I like to go through and just dab up in little spots. Like I said before, I just want some lighter spots and some darker spots, just so it looks more realistic and natural. So if you chose not to put fabric in the bottom of your dice box, this would be a good place to add that color in now. However, I think that the fabric is the way to go. You could even put in some construction paper or something. Painting this would be kind of a pain. It'd be really hard to do that without getting it on the edges. If you happen to have some clear coat spray paint, it's probably not a bad idea to go ahead and seal this up. It's not a requirement, but I always seal all of my projects up with clear coat. It just protects them a little bit. It makes them a little bit more waterproof, and it's just a good habit to get into. So I just took a piece of paper to make a pattern for my fabric. That way if I messed it up, it wouldn't be a big loss. This piece of felt actually has a sticky back, which I found in Joann Fabrics. It was just like a couple of bucks. You don't have to get the kind with the sticky back, it's just faster. You could get the cheaper sheets of felt without the sticky back and just glue them down if you want to save a couple of extra bucks, but I think this one was like $2 or something, and it was worth the extra money just to not have to deal with glue. Now I've got my fabric cut to shape, and I'm going to stick it in the bottom here. The good thing about the cheap canvas is, because it's not glued down, there's plenty of space underneath the frame, so I don't have to cut this out perfectly. I can just cut it just slightly too big and slip it under that empty space under the frame, and it should hide the edges of the fabric. Just start from the inside and work your way to the edges. Especially with this felt with the sticky back, you can move it around a little bit after you lay it down and just work out the wrinkles with your finger or some kind of like a credit card or paintbrush or something, and it'll smooth out very easily. You might have a little more trouble with glue depending on what you use. And there you go, there's your dice tray. You can make it look a lot better than this one if you take your time. You could draw more intricate designs. Dry brushing with gold always looks really cool. Use your imagination, play around. The possibilities are pretty unlimited here. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Welcome to the collective, and we hope to see you next time.